Ghost Stories from Chesham by Stephen Elkins Jarrett. To anyone who appears in this book whose name I have used, I hope they're not offended. To Carly, Emily, and William, to Joshua, Jordan, Jean, and Mark, who gave me the inspiration to write these ideas down. I hope you enjoy my stories. Can you see anything weird or odd in this photograph? It was taken inside 180 Boismore Road in 1993. Ah, there it is! Preface. Chesham is an old market town in Buckinghamshire and was first occupied by Saxon farmers who formed a pile of stones next to the River Chest, as far south of where we currently call Chesham the town. This was on the moor, and they used this site for praying to the sun, to the moon, to the stars, and obviously to the weather. The seasons were very important to these people, and in fact they prayed to the earth itself. It's where life really started. Prior to that, the area in the valley in the Chiltern Hills was first settled by Mesolithic people in a time between the Stone Age and the Paleolithic Age, over 10,000 years ago. These people set up camp in what we now call Stratford's Yard, where East Street adjoins Red Lion Street. These people moved on to find food and didn't settle here, but the Saxons were the first to plant seeds and gather animals and effectively become the first farmers. Then 4,500 years ago, the area became very popular for farming land and supporting the people who lived in the growing community in and around the area. During the Bronze Age, people settled along the valley, using the river as their lifeblood, with rich soil for farming and keeping animals more akin to what we today are using hedges to identify their borders and claim the land for themselves, fighting off intruders. Just 2,500 years ago, the Iron Age Belgics of the Calavunian tribe settled in the area now known as Dawes Close. The Romans were here too, for 300 years or so, both at Latimer and on the same site as the Belgics. Then the Dark Ages arrived, and it appears that for over 200 years Chesham was abandoned. In the 7th century, at 6 o'clock, on the 6th of June, 666, the Saxons arrived. Castlesham, a Saxon word for a water meadow by a heap of stones, were gathered and piled up to form an early altar, and Chesham was effectively born. Later in 1086, the Domesday Book mentions Chesham as Cestrum. The Baptist Church was born here in the 17th century, actually at 6 p.m. on the 6th of June, 1666, exactly 1,000 years after the Saxons had arrived. Now a thriving market town with woolen industries, brush making, lace, paper, straw, silk, and of course farming, the close-knit and isolated town was kept away from outsiders until the railway arrived in 1889, making the neighbourhood towns and London now within easy reach. Today it's a mix of commuters who travel daily into London, work in local businesses and trade, and a fairly large Asian community who arrived here in the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s. And they've grown into their own close-knit multicultural community with a recently opened new mosque to replace a house that they used to use before. But it's what happens in the ordinary lives of these people who have lived in Chesham in the same space as you, but not the same time, and spread over the last few hundred years that makes our stories come to life and hopefully familiar to you. Chapter 1. Halloween. The rain was bashing the glass and sliding sashes of 180 Boismore Road. It was Halloween night. 3 boys were sitting huddled together by an open fire, with the logs crackling and spitting as the fire twisted and turned and jumped its way up the chimney, changing colours as it did so. It rose into the dark recesses of the chimney. There were no lights on, just 2 candles and the light from the fire, making it quite eerie, and with no noise except the wind outside and the rain tapping on the window, asking to be let in. It really was quite spooky. The boys, Joshua, Jordan, and William, had begged for a ghost story, and they loved to be scared. So one of the fathers sat them down in front of the fire and intended to invent a ghost story to scare them. William was staring at the old wooden floorboards, and he noticed a strange pattern in the wood. It was very odd. He showed the others the weird pattern. Then Joshua noticed the pattern was repeated across the floor, and some were joined together to make what looked like a face. Was it a witch's face? And then it began to speak.
Hello, my name is Rose Creswell, and I am a witch who was burnt at the stake many, many years ago. I am here to tell you a few stories, but if you proceed, you must be warned that it carries a curse so dreadful that only a few can carry its burden. Can you carry it?
The boys nodded, and so it began. The clock struck 6. They waited for a minute in silence until another minute passed, and then another minute passed, and then a minute passed, quickly followed by another minute. Joshua looked at his watch. It was 6 minutes past. The boys, the narrator, and the other adults in the room were all there together, making it 6 people in the room at 6 minutes past on Halloween night. 666. 666 is the number of the beast and is the numerical value of the name of the person symbolized by the beast from the sea in the Bible and described as the first 2 symbolic beasts in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation. In most manuscripts of the New Testament, the number is 666 and describes the end of the world. And then Rose Creswell started to read her story.
Some of these stories are true and some are myths. Some have yet to happen. Gather round and hear my story. Some are old and some are gory. All affect the local land. All have lost an arm or hand. A ghost, a ghoul, a severed head. A story, the truth about the dead.
We start our story way back in time in 1266 at 6 p.m. on Halloween's night. Kirtle Road sits high on one side of the Chesham Valley, looking down into the town centre, and is now a mass of houses clumped together. But in 1266, the Lord Mayor of Chesham, Higham, lived in a castle on that site. His name was De Young, and the castle was called De Young Castle, translates today into the Youngs. Hugh de Young would make the journey in a carriage down to the weekly market in the High Street and Market Square to meet and greet the people and share with them some banter and ensure that the townsfolk were happy. He was a lovely man, rotund and jolly, a bit like Santa Claus, only bigger, and he didn't have a sack of toys, or a red costume, or a beard, or white hair. Actually, he didn't look like Santa at all. Anyway, he was a nice chap, kind and generous, and he often wore a blue and white horizontal striped top. The locals called him the Hoop Man. Unfortunately, he died. When he died, his son, Vlad de Younger, took over. He was evil and nasty, and he taxed the townspeople and tortured those who could not pay. Executions and punishments took place every Friday in the market square, and soon the public so feared him, the news had spread through the local towns and villages, and as he slowly controlled and took over their money, their food, and left them with absolutely nothing. One day, a visitor from another country came to stay with Vlad, and his name was Kurt Kurtle, or the Baron von Kurtel from Transylvania. He was even nastier than Vlad, and the locals believed that he was a vampire and a cannibal because he was never seen during the daytime, always wore black clothes and a long cape, and when the locals were invited to the castle, they were never seen again. Rumours spread that Vlad and the Baron would sit their guests on spikes, and their own body weight would make them slowly impale themselves, sliding into their body from their bottoms, into their internal organs, and finally into their brain and out through the top of their heads. A slow and painful death. The two men would spit roast their victims and then eat them. Vlad and the Baron suddenly and amazingly disappeared on Halloween's night, 1266, at 6 p.m., leaving this message written in blood and nailed to the old oak moat drawbridge. It read, "I will be back. Don't know when, and I might invite you for dinner." The castle was left to ruin and became known by the locals as haunted. Children claimed that they could hear screams of the missing, the crying of the dead, and some even claimed that anyone who entered the grounds was never seen again. By 1666, the castle was demolished by the new Chesham Town Council, and by 1866, the houses were being built on the land, some using stone from the original castle, and by 1966, the whole area was finished, and thousands of Cheshamites were now living on the site of the old haunted Kurtle Castle. Right on the spot where the dining hall would have been lies a house, number 45, Kurtle Road, where distant relatives still live today, the Young family, trying to hide their association with the Youngs of 800 years ago, but as they say, blood is thicker than water. And whenever anyone tries to redecorate the walls in that house, in whatever colour they choose, the next day the paint would still be wet, dripping down the walls, onto the floor, and worse than that, it would always be blood.